You know, if I ever had a gaming kink of sorts, it would definitely be playing random games nobody cares about, nobody's ever heard of, or that look like they suck. I'm not into asset flips, and the recent flood of AI drivel has kind of killed a lot of the value for me. But it can still be wonderful to see something that looks kinda jank, or really off the wall, or clearly like an idea that had more passion than sense, and try it. Street Race Kings is a game that, if I'm honest, looks like it's a cheap, thrown together game. The logo looks kinda stock, and the full name under it is impossible to read from a normal viewing distance on my 4K 43-inch television. The screenshots are mostly from nighttime races in cityscapes that look very repetitive and simple. A lack of proper anti-aliasing is also present, which is super common in asset flip garbage. And while the trailer has more production values than you'd expect for a game that's thrown together with no thought, and even has legitimate music rather than stock junk, it still gives the impression of a game that's going to be 30 minutes long, a game that's made to look richer than it is. I know that's a really harsh sentiment to start this video with, but I want my first impressions to be transparent. I clicked on the game because it was cheap, it was a racing game, and had a demo. Knowing what I know now, there are signs that the game is more than that assessment applies, but the shovelware ecosystem makes you hyper aware of certain red flags that crop up regularly. Still, the demo was small, and it had a demo in the first place. If you're trying to con people out of money for a garbage product, you don't let them try your scam for free and realize it's indeed not worth the money they might otherwise have just paid. By the end of the demo, this was a game I wanted to support, and I knew that without a shadow of a doubt. Doubly so when I looked the game up on YouTube and learned the developer, D-Hood Productions, pronounced D-Hood, not dude with an H in the middle of it, has a channel complete with devlogs about the project, clearly stated goals and intentions, etc. The game was on sale, so I picked it up. I want to be clear about something right now. This is a very small production that is fundamentally a solo dev project, and I also don't think the problem aesthetically here is a lack of attention, care, or quality. I think it's just that the limited means with which this game could be created just happens to align poorly with the preconceived notions and assumptions potential customers might have if they scour cheap games with even mild regularity. It presents bad from a marketing angle, rather than being bad, because this game is pretty fucking good. In some ways it's even great. It understands the player it's targeting and understands what it needs to be to satisfy that player. Moreover, once you get into the game proper and spend some time with it, the things that presented as red flags mostly become more clearly aesthetic choices. Aesthetic choices with some limitations, mind you, but they had purpose and intent behind them. So if you don't mind, I'd like to take some time to present Street Race Kings to you, and illustrate why it's a game that will almost certainly be worth your time and money if you're at all interested in the games it aims to be like. Also, before we dive into it, if this video ends up interesting you, maybe throw it a like, and share it to others you think might enjoy it. I've got plenty of other content like this as well, so definitely subscribe if you want 10 years of backlog to dive into. I'd also love to hear your thoughts if you've played Street Race Kings, or if there are any other games that might look bad on the surface but are similarly quality. It took me a few tries to figure out in what order to discuss elements of this game, because while I think it's really solid, it's not perfect. Eventually I settled on sharing the good bits first, because I want to make it crystal clear that this is a game worth giving a chance. So graphically, yes, the game is incredibly simple, but I think in a lot of ways it works. The nighttime maps have some cool lighting features like these light bulb trees, or these arch lights over the roads which add pops of color. It gives them a slightly out of this world futuristic vibe. The one daytime map, meanwhile, gives me strong Jet Set Radio Future vibes. It feels sparse at first in promotional material, but I think it's more accurate to say the world was designed within its means. Cars I'm less fond of visually, but they look okay enough. I like the choice to have a lot of them use LED strip style headlights and taillights, and some of the cars are still appealing to me. Things get stronger when we start talking about the camera work. Race intros, level intros, and other similar segments feel really solid. They match the race types in interesting ways and feel smooth. During races, the camera has just enough dynamism to keep visual interest, without getting in the way of actual racing. No complaints there. Meanwhile, I left on the slow motion jump camera because it's actually one of the best implementations I've ever seen, specifically thanks to the fact that the camera rotates to follow the car from the jump, meaning it basically always lands right back behind the car before switching to the gameplay camera again. This eliminates the biggest frustration of these sorts of cinematic camera angles. That being the usually jarring jump back to the full speed gameplay camera angle. No qualifiers, this game just does it better than most. Audio is even better than that, if you can believe it. Most games like this have maybe one contemporary music track that they'll use for trailers to trick you into thinking it'll be like an EA Black Box Need for Speed title. But that one song will loop forever, or races won't have music while menus only play that song, or they'll use really stock sounding basic music for everything. SRK has a full-ass licensed soundtrack. I'm going to assume they're royalty free or something, but that doesn't change the fact that the soundtrack is genuinely great, large enough, and varied. Were this in a mid-2000s racing game or extreme sports game, it would be one that's fondly remembered, and as far as I could tell, each map swaps a few songs around, and adds some on the secondary visit, meaning you're always running across new music as well. Even if the game has too limited of a soundtrack for you in a vacuum, I think you'll find that seemingly Jet Set Radio Future inspired choice keeps it feeling fresh. I cannot stress enough how much a quality soundtrack like this can transform a racing experience. The loading screens, meanwhile, initially might sound jarring or even grating to some, if you haven't played a game like Midnight Club 3, which has very similar loading screen vibes. It won't be for everyone, but I can't say the callback isn't nostalgic. Great sound design doesn't stop there. The engine sounds are surprisingly well crafted and pleasant, and there are shit tons of them. Tire squeal isn't too loud or obnoxious. There aren't a bunch of glitchy audio issues. The effects don't sound too synthetic, and there are sounds in all the places they need to be. D-Hood hits on things other games that are this low budget often miss, like the nice sound effect for going over curbs, quality crash sounds, glass breaking, etc. These are all things similarly scoped and priced games regularly fail at, and you don't realize how important they are until they're gone. So I wanted to highlight that this game nails it. About the only thing that stuck out slightly to me in a negative way was that I wished the rise in revs when you shift down was ratcheted up, but it's a minuscule thing. Tutorialization is solid too. While it can be a bit wordy in a couple of spots, it's clear, usually pretty concise, grammar and punctuation is good, and it's there when you need it without getting in your way. Okay, so what about gameplay then? None of that matters. If driving feels like trash, absolutely. And even if the driving is good, if the game is 45 minutes long and has no thought put into event types and progression, who cares? In both ways, SRK passes the bar handily and often keeps going. Firstly, the maps are small, yes, but there are 4 of them and each one has its own identity thanks to its layout. One might have wide open spaces between buildings, perfect for shortcuts, then another might have some more narrow roads or emphasize 90-degree turns, or even have a full freeway system with smaller pockets of city interspersed within. The streets in every area are still rather wide no matter what, which fits the physics well. It feels like a choice made by someone who understands the limitations of their game and how to maximize the good qualities while catering to racing fans. This feels like a set of maps designed for racing, with shortcuts and memorable map locations all over. The maps also have collectibles strewn throughout, but more than that, as you progress, it never stops adding more collectibles of different types. It's never an overwhelming amount though, and they always have some tangible gameplay value. And again, because the maps are small and pretty open, these collectibles are rewarding to stop off and grab. And to top it off, there are both AI difficulty and traffic density sliders. Are you like me and think traffic surprising you around a corner and ruining your race can suck? Then turn traffic completely off. Are you a masochist? Crank it up and suffer for that pleasure. Speaking of AI, they work, and they work well here. I don't think there is a rubber banding system here, though I could be wrong, but the AI was decently competitive and exhibited several advanced behaviors you, again, simply don't usually see in games of this scope. It took corners well, it could adjust to you smashing into it, they show real speed and some level of dynamism, they can take shortcuts, and they can even reset themselves if they crash and get stuck. The game progresses in a way that's not dissimilar to NFS Underground, Underground 2, or Midnight Club 3 and LA. Do races, get bank, spend bank on cars, car upgrades, and visual customization. There's a boss on each map, and you revisit each map for a second time. These revisits are smart because it means you're never spending too much time in one place, and you'll get to experience the earlier maps again with faster cars. It makes it feel like you're always moving forward, and the addition of new collectibles and even new shops as you progress adds flavoring. It feels like the perfect structure for a game that necessarily has to have such contained maps. Physics here are pretty great. Cars don't feel stuck on the road or inconsistent to drive, they slide well in races, but can also grip well enough most of the time. You can't fall asleep at the wheel, but it's also not excessively punishing. Different cars have different handling dynamics. They also have one of two different boost types, both of which are useful here. Eventually, you'll realize there are also engine swaps, and these are cool as fuck. You can legitimately swap the engine from any one car into any other one of the dozens of cars in the game. That swaps the sound and general performance while keeping your upgrades intact. But beyond that, each car has a certain compatibility level with each engine, so swaps can sometimes give you a bit of extra free power, or you might have to sacrifice some of what the engine might provide to another car that's more compatible. Ultimately, certain engine types seem almost universally better for most vehicles, and you kinda just look at the stats and pick the one that has the highest rating in the stat you're going for, between speed and acceleration, or both. But it's still a fun system, and every engine seems competitive enough by the end. Event types are also extremely diverse. You have normal circuits, point-to-point races, drift events, and drag events, sure, but you also have a ton of variations of them. There are linear drift events, or free drift events where you can drift anywhere. You have races where you just have to get to an endpoint by whatever means possible, or races where you can hit each checkpoint in any order. There are races where you head to a point and then head back. Checkpoint knockout races where the person in last at each checkpoint is kicked out of the race, impromptu races with AI just roaming the map, and more. One of my favorites, and one that I believe is unique to this game, is mirror races. It's basically a normal race, except half the grid does the race backwards, so there's a risk of hitting opponents head on, and you also won't always know if you've won until you're about to cross the finish line. And just like everything else, the game keeps adding more race types as you go, so that you never feel like you've just run out and are now grinding events on autopilot. It took me about 10 hours to do everything the game had to offer, and performance was pretty solid throughout. The game has also been getting meaningful updates since release, and as of writing this, the next update is literally going to be a map creator. It also has some level of mod support on PC and I believe Xbox, with D-Hood still trying to get it through Sony for the PlayStation, where I played the game. This includes custom maps and decals, the former of which interests me in particular. This game is proof that demos can help sales. I tried this game out of a somewhat morbid curiosity. I saw the basic graphics, the chaotic UI design, and the name, and figured it was another asset flip. But a demo with a small footprint could both be good for a quick laugh, and is strangely brave. Most asset flips and shovelware don't do demos because it would reveal the scam before people spend money they can't refund. But by the end of the demo, I had this game wishlisted. A day after, I couldn't help but to pick it up, and it was absolutely worth it. If that's all you care about, feel free to stop watching now, I guess. If you care about helping my channel grow by padding watch time though, or you want to know what I dislike about the game, then buckle up and keep watching. So first, let's discuss the things that I think more superficially affected this game negatively. There are genuine issues I take with some of this game's design, but there are also more minor things that I just think are rather weak, but are very easily overlooked given the quality of everything else. As I mentioned before, the aesthetic isn't always the most pleasant there is. While it's admirable that the UI tries to stand out in each shop and other areas of the game, it does kind of forsake clarity a lot of the time for aesthetic. Not to a horrible degree, but as someone who has a fair amount of experience in graphic design, it does at times feel like a bit of a mess, and that can bleed into the UX as well. Some menus like the car shop can be slow to respond or unclear, and in all menus you can only move to a different selection with the stick instead of the D-pad. It can make things feel just a bit clunky. I similarly don't love that I can't change the chase camera distance or the controls, the latter of which we'll discuss a bit more later. The look back function also rotates the camera back around instead of snapping forward. That's like a solid half a second where I'm not allowed to see where I'm going. The map doesn't always make it clear what roads cross over or under others, which can lose you some of the more freeform races. Speaking of, I wish the checkpoint after your current one was shown, maybe as a different color or darker shade. Since they aren't, on rare occasion the game surprises you with turns and such you didn't know you'd suddenly have to make, and that kind of pairs negatively with the fact that sometimes the visuals can be so simple that they blend together on the horizon, making it hard to tell what's ahead. Speaking of things being a bit hard to decipher, the FMVs are highly compressed in a way that's rather ugly. It might be intentional if they're going for authentic PS2 style. I can think of some games with really bad BINC encoding from back in the day. If that's the case though, it's way too extreme. If not, these definitely need re-encoded because sometimes it's impossible to tell what's even going on. I'm also not the biggest fan of the fact that intro scenes and various cutscenes aren't skippable for repeat race attempts or playthroughs. When you factor in the modest but not insignificant load times and these scenes, retrying a race can take upwards of 30 seconds. Other minor issues include stuff like the finish line being smaller than checkpoints even though visually they're the same size, meaning you can sometimes end up missing it unexpectedly, leading to a loss. A late game speed capture race illustrated this well when I got stuck on the wrong side of the freeway with no way to cross over. That meant I couldn't hit the finish line and lost, despite being in first. The final race has issues with this too, since it's so easy to end up on the wrong side, where there's really only one or two ways back on the track. It also forces you to stick close to the inside of the wrong side of the road, slowing you down and risking accidents. Making the finish line larger on some races would help the former example, giving players more places to cross over on the freeway on this last map, moving the checkpoints to the center between the roads, or resetting the player to the right side of the road when they hit the car reset button could all help with the latter issue. Moving on, I don't mind the lack of real cars whatsoever. I actually would like to see more games with imagined cars again, even if they're based on real-world cars. However, many of them here are kinda bubbly or inflated looking in a way that is a bit visually unappealing to me, and that distaste extends to the decals, which aren't my thing. Still cool that they're here though, and on PC you can add your own custom decals, which is also cool. The lack of real cars also carries other issues with it though. One of SRK's tooltips claims that different cars are good at different things, and this is true, but since these aren't real cars and many look like they could be mashups of several cars that handle completely differently, it can be hard to know what to invest in for specific tasks. Though again, it's a minor issue since it's not difficult to earn enough money to experiment a bit. And finally, the boss of your first visit to the fourth map has a single turn in his race that's kinda borked. Take it too fast, which is really easy to do, and you'll end up in an area that's seemingly outside the map, where I couldn't find a way back in. I was able to escape the entire drivable map this way and exceed 1,000 miles an hour though, which was kind of funny. I blazed through all of these minor things because while they did impact my experience in a way that collectively combined to be somewhat annoying, much of it I got used to, and none of it made me even close to frustrated enough to stop playing. The game has real problems though, so let's finally tackle them. It's here where we unfortunately get to the stuff that had me groaning in frustration from time to time. For a lot of people, drift events in these mid-2000s style arcade racers are the best events. Thankfully, drift events work how they should on a base level, with things like crashing resetting your current pool of points before they're banked. Just like everything else, it feels like a finished mode rather than an afterthought, to the point that it has different physics, just like in those black box NFS games. And one of the updates even augmented those physics further to improve them. That's real effort and passion that's worth commending. That being said, because you can't change the controls, people like myself end up stuck in an awkward position. I'm not good at controller drifting with L1 and R1 as shifting, because I'm used to doing the nuances of throttle and brake with my pointer fingers, not middle fingers. But if your car doesn't have the right transmission gear ratios for drifting, automatic doesn't work well either, as is par for the course in games like this, to be fair, and in real life. Drift events are the weakest purely because the automatic transmission shifts poorly, especially in faster cars. Faster cars also fly through corners in drifting like they're on ice, and hate getting up to speed after a mistake. Cars also love to get stuck at a tight angle that makes any amount of control almost impossible, if you're not extremely delicate. It's a very weird feeling because drifting well in a lot of cars, and a lot of the later events, requires the nuance of sim drifting, but the physics are really arcade-like at the same time. This could work, but for me, I'm surprisingly just not that much of a fan. If I could change the controls so shifting was on square and circle, and if cars got up to speed better, I think I'd enjoy it a lot more though. The final story boss's car, because yes, you can get the pink slips of bosses after beating them, also has a glitch that can basically ruin drifting with it, where in manual transmission it will try to reverse instead of brake, which means your brakes suck, and if you hit a wall it's almost impossible to get going forward again in a timely manner, since the tires are so slippery. I'm also not the biggest fan of how cars tend to hit walls like they're sandpaper, sticking pretty hard against them. It basically always stops your car still, not in a glitchy way, so it feels like a balanced punishment at first. But as races get harder and faster, it feels more and more unfair because the punishments get harsher and harsher when you're facing faster opponents. And that combines poorly with the fact that you usually have to switch into reverse, back up, and then correct your heading to drive off, because switching to and from reverse is slow as molasses in most vehicles. Only the most expensive car with full upgrades seemed to reverse quickly out of the ones that I tried. There is a car reset button, but it's also a bit slow, and if I'm not stuck completely, I usually avoid using such features. And that's sort of it. Oh, you thought I had a ton of stuff to complain more seriously about? So did I until I got to this section and realized how small it is. But that's legitimately it. A bunch of minor pesky things, and the fact that I don't love the drifting, how punishing crashes are later on, and how slow the reverse gear can be to engage. That's it. I got the Platinum Trophy on this game and enjoyed 95% of my time with it. I also would have no qualms with the idea of starting another save and doing it again for fun, like I often do with the games it emulates. It's not perfect, it's not a mind-blowing return to every facet of those old games you might love, but it's a really solid, contained indie version of those ideas that deserves a lot more respect than I'm certain many people, including myself, gave it at first glance. At very least for the physics and that soundtrack. On sale or otherwise, if you like what you see, support an indie dev and grab yourself some SRK.